I hope this finds you well. In January of 2016, the Supreme Court looked at a number of cases. These cases involved everything from death sentences, unwanted text messages, statute of limitations, attorney's fees, and ERISA claims. Let's get started. First up is Bruce versus Samuels et al., decided on January 12th. This case concerned the Prison Litigation Reform Act and filing fees for indigents, or people without a lot of money. So the petitioner in this case, Bruce, had more than one filing fee. He was an inmate in Talladega, and the opinion described him as sort of litigious, having numerous cases. This one particular case against the prison was because Bruce was actually in a unit where there were violent criminals and gang-affiliated members, and they didn't separate the gang-affiliated members. The Prison Litigation Reform Act determines how much an indigent person is required to pay for those filing fees, and the text of it includes that the individual must pay the initial partial filing fee at a rate of 20% of the average monthly deposits in the prisoner's account, or 20% of their average monthly balance that's in the account over the prior 6 months. So the court found that the Prison Litigation Reform Act is on a per case basis and not a per prisoner basis. Hurst versus Florida was also decided on January 12th. So what happened was Hurst was convicted of first-degree murder, and he was then sentenced to death. He appealed that and received a new sentencing hearing, but again was sentenced to death. The case then finally made its way to the United States Supreme Court. And it's important to note that the Supreme Court recently held in a case called Ring versus Arizona, Arizona's sentencing scheme to be invalid, while the Florida Supreme Court said that Ring versus Arizona didn't apply to Florida's death sentencing scheme. The Supreme Court ultimately ruled in this case that Florida's sentencing scheme, or death sentencing scheme, I should say, violates the Sixth Amendment because the jury must make all the critical findings in a determination of a death sentence. On January 20th, 2016, Campbell-Ewald versus Gomez was decided, and that case concerned text messages from the Navy to the individual Gomez. The text messages weren't directly sent by the Navy. The Navy actually contracted with Campbell to send these text messages to individuals that had opted in to receive these text messages. The text messages were focused on individuals from the age of 18 to 24. Gomez was actually a 40-year-old who never opted in to receive these text messages. So Campbell argued that they were immune from suit based on derivative sovereign immunity. The Supreme Court found that Campbell's not entitled to derivative sovereign immunity because they exceeded their authority given to them by the Navy by sending text messages to Gomez, who had not opted in to receive the text messages. The Supreme Court also stated that a contractor can be immune from suit under that derivative sovereign immunity unless they exceed the scope of the contract. Montanilla versus the Board of Health was decided on January 20th, 2016, and this case concerned ERISA, Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1975. That act regulates the employee benefit plans. In this case, Montanilla was struck by a drunk driver and was severely injured. The board paid out $120,000 towards some of his medical care, if not all of his medical care, and Montanilla later sued the drunk driver and won a $500,000 settlement. Well, the way ERISA works is they can seek to get repayment for the money that they paid out. Well, the attorney for Montanilla told the board that they would be giving the money to Montanilla unless the board objected. The board didn't respond to the attorney, so the attorney dispersed the funds to Montanilla. Well, the board then decided to bring suit against Montanilla to recover the $120,000. But at that point, Montanilla didn't have the settlement anymore. It had been dispersed and used on untraceable services. Basically, he didn't have the money anymore. So the board wanted to attach to Montanilla's personal and separate assets. The Supreme Court didn't allow this and stated that once those identified assets have been completely dissipated or spent, ERISA's claim cannot extend to an individual's general assets. Also decided on January 20th, 2016 was Kansas versus Carr, and this case concerned the Eighth Amendment and the death penalty. So the Carr brothers, two individuals, in December of 2000 were involved in what's come to be known as the Wichita Massacre. At that time they committed assaults, rapes, and I believe it was 2 murders. The brothers were tried together, convicted together, and sentenced to death together. The brothers argued on appeal that their Eighth Amendment rights had been violated because their trials weren't severed and the jury instructions didn't clearly state that the defense didn't have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt mitigating circumstances before the death sentence could be imposed. The Supreme Court ruled that the Eighth Amendment doesn't require that the jury be instructed that the defendant does not have to prove mitigating circumstances beyond a reasonable doubt. And furthermore, the Eighth Amendment doesn't cover any procedural issues such as severance. On that same day, in Duncan versus Owens, a habeas corpus case, the Supreme Court improvidently granted a dismissal, meaning that they shouldn't have accepted the case anyway. 5 days later, on January 25th, 2016, the court decided James versus Boise. In this case concerned a civil rights lawsuit and the award of attorney's fees to the defense. So Melanie James was bitten by a police dog from the City of Boise Police Department. The officers, I guess, that were handling the dog were mistaken and thought that Miss James was actually a burglar. Miss James brought a number of tort claims against the police department for the dog bite. Her suit was then dismissed at the district court level because the officers were immune under the Idaho Tort Claims Act, and the district court found that James failed to show that the officers acted negligently. She then appealed to the Idaho Supreme Court, and the Idaho Supreme Court affirmed the district court's ruling and also awarded attorney's fees to the defendant. They did this without determining if the plaintiff's action was frivolous, without foundation, or unreasonable. And the reason why the Idaho Supreme Court had to determine before awarding the attorney's fees to the defendant if the plaintiff's action was frivolous, without foundation, or unreasonable is because in 1980 the Supreme Court decided Hughes versus Roe, where they interpreted Section 1988 and how attorney's fees are awarded in this kind of case. So the Supreme Court ultimately ruled that state courts are always bound by the Supreme Court's interpretation of any federal law, in this case, Section 1988. Amgen Incorporated versus Harris was also decided on January 25, 2016, and that was another ERISA case where the employee stock options were at issue. So here, former employees of Amgen Incorporated as well as current employees filed a complaint and were in a class action suit over Amgen's stock. And one of the causes of actions that they alleged was a breach of the duty of prudence. For this claim to hold any kind of muster in court, the plaintiffs must allege that there was an alternative action that the defendant, the Amgen Incorporated, could have taken that would have been in line with other securities laws, and that a different prudent fiduciary, someone handling the money in the same circumstances, would not have viewed as more likely to have a negative impact on the fund. The Ninth Circuit dismissed the case. The Supreme Court ruled that the Ninth Circuit failed to properly apply the standard to determine whether or not a breach of the duty of prudence was properly alleged, and that standard comes from a case, Fifth Third versus Dudenhofer. Next we have the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission versus Electric Power Supply Association. This was also decided on January 25, 2016. So this case concerned the Federal Power Act, which granted authority to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, Energy, to regulate the selling of electric energy at wholesale interstate commerce levels. So Energy decided to create a rule surrounding uniform compensation for different energy suppliers. The rub came where the energy rule conflicted with promoting a competitive market. So the Supreme Court held that Energy has the authority to make the rules under the Federal Power Act, and that rule that they created doesn't limit any retail market, it only limits wholesale markets. And the Federal Power Act still allows for states to regulate the retail market. I know I'm going to butcher this tribe name, so I'm just going to call them the tribe, versus the United States. This case was also decided on January 25th, and this case concerned the statute of limitations relating to contract cost. So from 1995 to 2004, the tribe provided health services to members of the tribe under a contract with the Secretary of Health and Human Services. This contract, in essence, stated that any services that the tribe provided to tribe members that the government didn't have to provide, well, the government would reimburse those expenses. In 2005, the tribe attempted to recover costs that they had given out from 1995 to 2004 under the contract. However, services provided from 1996 to 1998 were denied because of a 6-year statute of limitations. The tribe, on the other hand, argued that the statute of limitations shouldn't have been running because of extraordinary circumstances. Ultimately, the Supreme Court held that the tribe didn't prove extraordinary circumstances which were out of their control to prevent that statute of limitations from running. To be entitled to equitable tolling, which is a pause for the statute of limitations, the litigant must be able to establish first that they've been pursuing the rights diligently and that there were extraordinary circumstances that prevented the timely filing of a claim. Next we come to Montgomery versus Louisiana, decided on January 25, 2016. And this case concerned the Eighth Amendment again, and more directly a case decided in 2012, Miller versus Alabama, and whether that case applied retroactively. In Miller versus Alabama in 2012, the Supreme Court found that the Eighth Amendment prohibits children convicted of a homicide to have a mandatory sentence of life without parole. So in this case, the Montgomery case, Henry Montgomery was 17 years old when he murdered a Charles Hunt in 1963. The Supreme Court ruled Miller versus Alabama applies retroactively. And furthermore, when the Supreme Court rules on a substantive constitutional right, it always applies retroactively because it outweighs any procedural rules. And finally, on January 25, 2016, the Supreme Court ruled on Masaccio versus the United States. And this case concerned jury instructions and the sufficiency of evidence, as well as a statute of limitations defense. Ultimately, the Supreme Court ruled that the defendant can't raise a statute of limitations defense for the first time on appeal. Masaccio was the president of a transportation company that arranged shipments. He resigned from that position in 2004 and started his own competing company in 2005. When he started that company, he also took some of the employees from the company that he had resigned from, ETS. It was discovered that Masaccio and some of these employees that he took with him were continuing to access ETS computers. So ETS and the new company that Masaccio started, TTS, agreed to a $10 million settlement. Well, in 2010, the government decided to indict Masaccio and a couple of those employees for conspiracy and violating the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. At trial, the jury was instructed of greater elements than were written in the statute. The government didn't object to the jury instruction given by the judge with the additional or greater elements. Ultimately, Masaccio was convicted. Masaccio later appealed, arguing that since the government didn't object, then they had to prove those higher elements that were in the jury instruction. The Supreme Court disagreed, however, and held that the sufficiency of evidence is measured against the elements of the statute and not the elements that are laid out in a jury instruction. Thanks for watching.